much to organizers, and thank you very much for everybody in the audience sticking today as well. So what I'll be talking more is about unsupervised machine learning methods, and the talk that Misha gave earlier related to tensor methods. We are applying tensor factorization techniques, so there will be a lot of overlap with what you already heard. But the key what we want to emphasize, I'm sure everybody in the audience knows what is the difference between supervised and unsupervised. But the key is that really supervised requires data to train, and it's very efficient to recognize cats and dogs, but if you give an image for something else, you cannot recognize it. So practically supervised machine learning in general cannot find something that we already know, because we need labeling, we need training. Unsupervised methods are more powerful to extract hidden features, something which is inside the data. That's why it's related to exploratory analysis or data-driven science. And so in contrast with supervised, we can find what are the features which are needed to distinguish between cat and dogs. And so this is potentially a little bit more informative, just distinguishing what is cat and dog. The other issues related to supervised machine learning methods is that, of course, through training, we can introduce subjectivity. This was discussed in some of the previous talks. In general, we don't understand why the machinery recognizes cats and dogs. There is some secret inside there. It's very difficult to unravel really what is the machine learning understand why cats and dogs are different. Also cannot make predictions outside of the training range. I mean, if you train it for the given range, you cannot go outside of this. And also, one thing which also was discussed is this is highly discussed after Google published this paper that showed that very small noise in the images that you cannot see in the image actually can substantially impact the accuracy of the prediction of the machine learning techniques. And because most of the data that we're dealing typically in science have a lot of noise, I mean, this immediately shows you, oh, maybe you have to be careful when we're dealing with noise when we're processing data. Of course, we always have to have XKCD slide when you do nerdy talks, but this is how machine learning is captured here. I mean, if it's not working, just steer it more, and potentially at the end you'll get good results. The other thing which I also talk about is non-negativity, and this is from a paper which was published in Nature in 1999, and it has a huge number of reference after that. But the key was to compare this NMF non-negative matrix factorization method with standard PCA. They proposed NMF as a more efficient technique to understand and have meaningful results compared to classical PCA techniques. And what is clearly here, I mean, they did machine learning on images of faces. And so, for example, this is one of the facial images that they analyzed. And both techniques can reconstruct very well the original image. However, when you have non-negativity, you can see that actually this face is combination of different facial features. So here, the whites are zeros, blacks are ones. And you multiply this by this, and you get some feature here. You multiply, so you have this multiplication between elements in this matrix to reconstruct this. When you do PCA, again, you get good reconstruction, but you have your average face from all the training images and all the subtractions and additions that need to be done. Here, the red is negative to reproduce the image. So here you can clearly better see that this face, for example, have this, and these dominant features to reconstruct here. Now here I also see these features, but because there is subtraction, not only additions, it's a little bit, the interpretation is much more complicated. And so what I'll be talking about is going to high dimensions, not to stick in 2D, what is here. So when you go to high dimensions, you can think that what we want to adding another dimensionality is this is, for example, time changing of the face of this person over the years as he's getting younger and younger, how this changes and how these features modify over time. So you can add one more dimensionality about time when you're talking about non-negative tensor factorization, which I'll be mostly talking about. So I'll be talking a lot about discovering these facial features in data that we're analyzing. Another way to think about this is Unsupervised machine learning methods really are very powerful, can be applied to analyze data, you can be applied to analyze model outputs, and I'll be showing examples of both. But also they're very, very powerful when we want to do something what is so frequently called data model fusion, when we're applying both models and data to improve our understanding what is happening in real world. I'll not talk much about data fusion, data model fusion in this talk, but definitely this is one of the important aspects of our coming work. So, so as I mentioned, our focus is non-negative matrix tensor factorization. We developed a series novel unsupervised machine methods related to this. We call them NMFK and NTFK. And because we couple these techniques with existing libraries which allow efficient use of GPUs and TPUs, we can really aiming to solve very big problems. So this is, again, the talk that was earlier about the tensor decomposition is a perfect segue to this portion of the talk. And this was already shown what is tensor 3D Terkel tensor decomposition. I'm showing it again. So you have big three-dimensional tensor. Again, I'll be showing 3D, but our techniques work for any kind of dimensionality directly, the way they were coded. So it's much more difficult to show 4D. But when you have 3D, you have KMN, some multi-way array, and you can be decomposed by a core tensor, which now has small dimensionalities, KMN, which are associated with the dimensionality of the original tensor, small numbers, and you have multiplication of these matrices, the factors of the tensor decomposition, which characterize some of the properties associated with data in these directions. And here is how it's presented mathematically, similar again to the talk earlier. We don't need to do always decomposition in all directions. We can decompose only in given directions. For example, if you decompose only 2 directions, we can have 3 different combinations of those, and also we can decompose only in 1 direction. And again, we have 3 different versions of this in 3D case. When we have 3-dimensional deconstruction of tensor, you can think about these matrices which on the sides. We can think about those as a series of vectors. So, for example, like in this case, we're deconstructing data to a tensor which currently has 3, 4, 5 dimensionality. And you can think that there are like 3 vectors in this direction, 4 vectors in this direction, and 5 vectors in this direction. And this is something like a basis functions if you want to kind of go back to SVD, machinery way of thinking, to more frequently used methods. This is something like a basis functions which characterize your data. And if you also go to say that this is, for example, X and Y, and this is time, so this is like a multiple slices of faces of person is aging, or it's a process which changes over time. This will be multiple slices over time, and this will be the features which characterize the temporal changes. This will be features which characterize X and Y. So it's very convenient to multidimensional analysis. And now I'll show you just very simple example how this can be applied. So if you have now these three vectors, V, W, and H, we can generate them simple synthetic problem that we have 3 temporal features, 4 X and 5 Y features, and we can combine them. Here we have possible 60 combinations, but in this case assume that it's sparse, and we have 12 ones and the remaining zeros. So we have only these combinations of expressions to compute X. And when we put this in the machinery, this is what you get. I mean, this is practically the 3D visualization of this tensor, which is this sequence of the images. When multiply these matrices by this score, you get this. And this is kind of typical movie that potentially you will have for different problems. And when we just analyze the resulting tensor, we can reconstruct the number of features in every single direction. So this is the original, the truth that we put, and this is what is the prediction for this very simple problem, but it's very easy to extract this, but we can really very well reproduce the original basis functions or features which existed in these different directions. Of course, we don't know the mathematical expression, which is this, but we can extrapolate and interpolate. So if you want to see, I mean, if you believe that this model is accurate and propagates in the same way for t greater than our predictive period, we can extrapolate out of this region and make prediction outside of the region. We can also interpolate between inside between this. And because, as mentioned earlier, we also achieve compression, this type of interpolations are much easier and much faster to be done on the compressed tensor, on the decomposed tensor than the original tensor. The other way you can look at this as well is now, these are the three temporal features that you have seen earlier, and these are the three facial expressions which are associated with this feature. So with this feature, this is the facial expression. With this feature, this is the facial expression. And with the green feature, the third one, this is the facial expression. And these are like matrices which are multiplied by these vectors and to reproduce the tensor, the dynamics of the tensor. So in this case, we even know what is the mathematical form of these matrices. But in reality, in one case, we will not. But the key is now we can see that adding this tensor, which is on this side, with this tensor, with this tensor, we're getting the original tensor. And this is capturing the dynamics of the first feature over time. This is the dynamics of the second feature over time. This is the dynamic of the third feature over the time. So it's intuitively, again, it's very powerful. This is a synthetic example, and most of the examples which I'll be showing later will have the same structure. So it's very related to, once you understand this, you understand the remaining of the analysis. Another very simple example for Terkel decomposition. This is a 50 by 50 by 50 tensors. We have 50 columns, 50 rows, and 50 time frames. And we have ones moving in this sea of zeros. And again, just analyzing this, we can identify this is the original data, this is the reconstruction, but the reconstruction is easy to be done. But what we know is that we understand that we have 6 different groups moving with different velocities, that there are 48 time frames and 44 occupied lanes by swimmers, and we can group those so we can identify and group swimmers which are moving with the same velocity. There are many challenges with application of these techniques. The number of features, what is the non-zero elements in the core tensor is difficult to solve. It was mentioned in the most general case is NP hard problem. What we're trying to achieve this is through imposing constraints, sparsity constraints on the core tensor through non-negativity and using k-means clustering of the output results to understand what is the optimal number of features. We also use the reconstruction quality and the cluster silhouettes of these k-mean clusters that we're generating. I will not have much time to go in this direction. I'll emphasize more results. If you're interested more, I can reference to the papers. We also have a challenging optimization problem because it's in many cases non-unique. Again, regularization, multi-start, starting multiple times with random initial guesses, non-negativity constraints help. We also can apply many different algorithms which are accessible through our framework. And also, if you're accounting for the physics, we're trying to address big data. Again, GPUs, TPUs, distributed computing helps. Sparsity and the structure of the data helps. We're also going in direction of negative tensor trains, which also were mentioned earlier. Noise definitely impacts the results, but what is interesting is that if you have systematic noise, this will be discovered as a separate signal. So discovering systematic noise can be helpful. Random noise impacts the result, but we think that we know how to deal with this. And these techniques are relatively fast. I mean, this is for very simple problem, 4 gigabyte tensor, 1,000 by 1,000 by 1,000. If our framework, even though it's written in Julia, if you love MATLAB and you also use MATLAB algorithms, I mean, but MATLAB is very fast, very slow, excuse me. If you want to use NumPy, again, because you love NumPy, again, it's very slow. And this is kind of currently the state of the art of the distributed TPU, CPU techniques, PyTorch supported by Facebook, and TensorFlow by Google, and MXNet, which is open source framework. All of them open source, but this is kind of community-based, not related to company. And all these are performances on my laptop without any special tweaking or any kind of, I mean, definitely they can be improved. And especially, I mean, the PyTorch and TensorFlow are very good when you go to big cloud computers, which we're currently doing in our analysis. But using Julia directly and natively also is very fast. This also scales very well. So with the sensor size and with fixed 256 CPUs, this is the performance you get with increase of the tensor size. So we analyzed diverse number of data sets, field data, lab data, operational data, for example, the neutron accelerated Delano or extraction of hydrocarbons from oil and gas. We did a lot of analysis of model outputs, and I'll be talking about some of those in minutes. But so far, I mean, again, in many cases, I don't understand what the data is. I mean, it's very efficient and powerful. This is the list of the recent papers that we submitted and the collaborators that we work on this. Again, if you're interested more, we'll give you more information. But and we have more papers upcoming soon. So the first real problem which I'll show you to apply this technique is reactive mixing problem. So here, in this case, we have two species, A and B, and initially there is a barrier between A and B, and they don't interact. And time equals 0, this barrier is removed, A and B start reacting. And colleagues of ours did detailed simulations of these processes, and there are 5 input parameters which control the mechanisms of this reactive mixing. There are vortices. Some of them control the location of the vortices, the velocity of the movement of this species along the vortices. I mean, this is like a merry-go-round around this area. That so I'll explain a little bit. So what is happening at the moment A and B see each other, they convert immediately into C. So what here is shown is the concentration of C. I'm not showing the concentration of A and B, which we also know, and we can analyze it as a 5-dimensional tensor, but we're just doing 3-dimensional tensor analyzing only C. So here C, the concentration of C, is a result of A and B seeing each other, and because in this area where the vortex is, there is a lot of B in the center, but because it's limited by the diffusion and dispersion, actually they don't fully interact. So they still be there, and A cannot see it to convert it to C. Here in this case, everything is converted to C. Here you can see it's more efficient because the size of the vortex is much smaller. But again, these are very complicated simulations. We have a lot of those. These are the different vortex structures, how many vortices you have. And these are different dimensionless parameters which define the velocity along the vortices and their number. And so we didn't know any of this. We just did bind analysis of using our technique to be able to see what kind of features we're able to extract. So, and we also did humongous compression. I mean, the whole simulation is 200 gigabytes. We compressed it to 70 megabytes. But the key is that we reduce substantially dimensionality. So we have 1,000 time frames which characterize all these times which now the movie is showing slowly to propagate in 1,000 time frames, 81 by 81 x and y, and we deconstructed to 3 time features, 12 in x and 13 in y. So this is the major reason for this compression. And now it's very easy to operate with this compressed tensor rather than with the big one if we want to do interpolation or extrapolation. And so here, similar to the first movies which I showed you earlier, these are the 3 features, 1, 2, and 3. And this predominantly is associated with initial advection when the process occurs and A and B start interacting. This is the slow dispersion which occurs in the vortices, and this is even the slower diffusion. And this is, again, similar to what I've shown earlier. These are the 3 features, again, how they change in time. And this is the facial expression of these 3 features and how these facial expressions are changing over time. This is, for example, the impact of one of the dimensionless parameters which changes the shape of these basis temporal functions. So this is the temporal function, the basis functions in time, depending on what is the value of this. So now what is interesting, what we're trying to do is to get intermediate values between those, because this is very highly computationally intensive to compute. We cannot compute for all the values for this dimensionality factor. We need to do interpolation based on these results, but this technique allows us to do this. The next example which I'll show is, and again, I have no idea. I mean, I know climate as much as I've seen the weather predictions on TV, but this is model simulations done by our colleagues in Germany. This is, again, heavy, high computationally expensive simulations where, and this is the fluctuations of the air temperature in 2003. You can see the dates, and this is the dynamics. And this is 365 days, 424 by 412 x and y, and 4 gigabytes compressed, again, substantially. But what is more important, I mean, here you can see a lot of features. And now we're extracting all these features. For example, we want to see the facial expression of the Alps, how it's changing different mountains. Baltics seem to be very important region. But so we try to identify what are the features here. And on first cut result, this is what we're getting. We're identifying the spatial, the facial expression of the storm signals, of the winter signals and the summer signals, and this is how they temporarily fluctuate over time. And so this is the storm frequency is something like a weekly basis when the storms arrive from Atlantic. This is the blue and green, that's why winter and summer, because these are the features which propagate on a climate on the annual basis. And this is the dynamics, how these facial expressions change in time. The next one, which I'll show, is example. This again, the same work did in Germany. Now the simulations are predicting the fluctuations of the water table in entire Europe. You can see the locations of the rivers. You can see impacts from infiltration under some of the mountains. So a lot of dynamics of changes in the water table depth below the ground surface over the same period of 2003. And again, we're able to identify features which, again, working with the subject matter experts, this is associated with the spring snow melt. So this is the facial expression of the spring snow melt. These are the summer rainfalls, the temporal feature and the facial expression. And this is overall seasonality. And again, when you join those, this is how the 3 tensors are generated when they combine, reproducing the original tensor. And and what is interesting in this case is that in this type of analysis, we can also I mean, as I said, we're exporting what is the number of features, number of temporal features that are important. If you have 2 temporal features, this will be how they look like. This will be the snow melt, the spring snow melt, and this will be seasonality. But if you're adding more features, this is the result with 3, which I just showed you, where we have also understanding about the summer. Now we are getting additional feature, but you can see any additional feature that we're getting is kind of additive. It's not like totally destroying our original result. It's we're adding, and because of this additivity constraint, we're adding and adding better understanding of the data, but we're not totally rewriting what we already discovered. So this is also another thing which is very important for analysis of this. And overall goal is to analyze. We have more than 40 state variables which characterize different features of this model, and we want to analyze all of those simultaneously. Currently, we don't have the machinery to do this because it's huge data, but we are going in this direction. Another example is US climate data. This is the precipitation over 768 months, which I don't know how many it is, how many years, I'm sorry. But this is the year count of the date which the data is showing. And again, we can do the same way, characterizing the facial expression of these features, where we can see where most of the dominant changes are occurring in which parts of the US. And again, we're working with subject matter experts because, again, I don't know much about climate, but this is how we are separating the information. And this is the same thing for temperature. And again, I can show many examples. What I want to switch on is to show you very quickly another example. This is related to contaminant migration. So if you have plumes which are with different geochemical characteristics, and you have 3 wells, so you have 2 plumes and 3 wells, and they are observing some mixed geochemical signatures of those plumes, and this is the data they observed in those 2 wells, we'll be able to separate and distinguish the contaminant plumes that exist in these wells. And this is work which we did with actual data at Los Alamos. This is a bunch of monitoring wells, and all these wells observing geochemical fluctuations over time. And when you see this, I don't think, I mean, our geochemists couldn't see really what is in the data because there's so much noise. But at the end, what we did through the machine learning method is something similar to what is kind of classical 101 chemical class. I mean, you have 7 beakers with different geochemical composition, how much you need to mix from each of these beakers to reproduce the concentration of each of these wells. And so our techniques was to identify what is the optimal number of beakers and what is the concentration of the water in these beakers. So this is the concentrations of the 7 beakers which are identified. So, and this is the geochemical composition of these species. And so every single well, which I showed you on the previous figure, was mixture of these 7 original chemical types. And we can see how we are reproducing the data in individual wells. So here the solid lines are the data, and the dashed lines are the machine learning predictions. Overall, we're predicting very well. We're seeing how the dynamic changes over time of this mixing of different signatures. But what at the end we can do, which again, if you're a geochemist or if you know about modeling your geochemistry, this will be very complicated, multi-degree problem to solve the dynamics of these geochemical species over time. Through machine learning on this laptop, I can get these simulations for a couple of minutes. So I can, excuse me. So this animation of how, based on the data, different chemical plumes are moving in space and time, I can get this on a laptop for 10 minutes. If we have to build a numerical model to characterize this behavior, I don't know how long it will take building and executing it and everything else. So it's extremely powerful to perform this type of spatial and temporal interpretations. And one more thing that I want to discuss is analysis that we did on seismic events on geyser geothermal field in California. And again, I am not expert. I don't know even what earthquake is. I'm joking. I learned the previous talk what is earthquake. But there are 470,000 seismic events between 2003 and 2016. They identified the location of the earthquakes, X, Y, and Z, and the magnitude, and many other characteristics. Here we only analyze the X, Y, and the magnitude of these events, and this is again time on a daily basis, the location of this and the magnitude of the seismic events. Again, we similar to everything what we did. I mean, this is 50 by 34 by 481.8 in time. We plugged in our machinery, and these are the three of the dominant features that we'll be able to extract. And this is the facial expressions of these features, and this is how these facial expressions are changing over time. Again, this is the red is the first one, the blue is the second one, the third one is the green, this one. And again, we got the results. I don't know what it means, but we're working with subject matter experts which looked at the data. But let me first show you how, again, these dynamics look like over time, how the facial expressions of these three features change over time, and when you combine them, we are reproducing the original portion of the original data. And so when we looked at to compare the signals, so that two of the features which we identified, the green one and the red one, the green one is related to the introduction of enhanced geothermal system, which started in 2011. So without knowing at all about, and without knowing what is enhanced geothermal system, again, I'm joking, we were able to identify the change in the seismic activity associated with it. And again, not that this feature didn't exist before, but it was substantially changed its magnitude. The other feature, the red feature, seems to be related to the amount of water which was injected in this system. So this is, again, very quick and dirty and preliminarized. There's so much more data that we can be analyzed, but we haven't done this yet, but this is very promising. And also, this is the spatial footprint of this green and red feature. So the green feature is the one which is associated with the EGS, the enhanced geothermal system, which is located right here. So you can see that there is a quite overlap, and some of the green features associated with EGS show up away from the location, and there is a more complicated dynamics between those two features. Another analysis that we did was that because at Los Alamos we have recently got D-Wave quantum computer, even though some people question is it quantum, but this is another story. But we reproduced the original analysis that was done in the Nature paper in 1999 using quantum computing. We used the original 2,400 faces, which was used in the NMF analysis in 1999, and we did the same analysis with our quantum machine, and it's similar. It's not exactly equivalent to what was done in the original paper, but the key is, again, we're able to reproduce. This is the original space, which is approximately reproduced, and it's a combination of features, of spatial features that we identified. So we compressed all these 2,400 faces to 35 characteristic features. And the last example, which I want to show you, because this is a 4D actually problem. Again, I don't know what it is. It's a polymer transition between different states. We have 201 states, 64 by 64, and 3 faces. And what was challenging was to identify the transition time or transition. What is the state variable? What is the state which defines the transition between different type of structures in the data? So what is interesting is that initially everything is in Kells. After that, there's some bubbles, cell formed, and after that there was more worm kind of structure. So this transition period, which is between this feature and this feature, is the time where we are transitioning from cell to worm-based structures, and after that again goes on. Again, this is still in the worm phase, and after that again we're going to cells or ball structure. But we're able to identify the transitions between these different structures in the data without any knowledge, just putting it in the machine learning machinery. So in summary, we developed these machine learning methods based on non-negative factorization of matrices and tensors. We solved various real-world problems, and one of our colleagues used a lot of this work related to human genome cancer as well, and this really produced breakthrough discoveries in this area. And we apply this for various type of Lano applications, and the key is that we're targeting big data and high dimensionality in our techniques as currently designed, because the way they're written, they can address any kind of dimensionality problem. And again, if interested, we're going to release all this in open source soon. They're not open source released yet. This code is already open source release, which has some of the features there. But let me know if you're interested. Thank you very much. I mean, again, it's a question of how big of a hardware you have. I mean, technically, we don't have limitations algorithmically or methodologically. So it's just a question of crunching time. And again, we have I mean, our techniques scale pretty well overall. Excuse me?
The data that is not uniformly sampled, like some of the well data, putting them between tensors.
Yeah, we can deal with sparsity. I mean, there is no requirement to have full tensors. So if your question is, can we deal with sparsity, like the geochemical data had sparsity in it, and some of the other data sets which are showing sparsity. Of course, dealing with sparsity, I mean, can be, I mean, it's important to be accounted for, but some of the techniques, because you cannot use the multiplicative algorithm if you have sparsity, for example. You have to use some of other techniques, which sometimes are a little bit more computationally intensive, so you have to pay a price. I mean, again, this is, I mean, the power of this technique is that allow you to mine the data and identify features in space, time, or whatever dimensionality you're dealing with. Now, it's up to subject matter expert to say, is this meaningful feature or not? I mean, when you use unsupervised machine learning, because you're not labeling anything, I cannot say, oh, this is diffusion, or this is dispersion. I mean, based on the shape of the curve, like we did in the analysis for reactive mixing, I can guess that this is dispersion because it looks like square root of time. But for the seismicity, first, I don't know what is earthquakes, and second, that's why we're working with subject matter expert. But again, this is something that we can talk.
For the European
Yes. I mean, this is, again, this is the key NP hard problem to discover what is the optimal number of features. We currently run it all to 100 features. So we have results for 100 features, and we now, based on the results we're getting, we do multi-starts. We're solving this multiple times with predetermined number of features. Then we're looking back to identify what is the optimal number of features which are needed to characterize this. And the analysis is not done yet, so I cannot tell you there are 56 features in 2003 in European climate because we haven't performed the analysis, but we have already the results. But my point is that, for example, this is something quite very important. I mean, if you analyze 2003 data and see that there are 10 features, and after you analyze 2016 data and see that there are 20 features, you need to understand why. And this is something that, again, it's a useful information. I can imagine it's useful information for the people who do climate modeling, but I don't know what is the interpretation. Yes, yeah. No, we keep adding. I mean, this is, I mean, you can think about also like hierarchical Terkel, which again was, I mean, we are extracting features at every single time. One option is not to restart with what was the original data and that new feature, to analyze the remaining, so you can do hierarchical analysis as well. I mean, the key at the end is to have white noise. I mean, everything that, after you reconstruct everything, at the end you have to have white noise. Or you have something that you don't care about, which, again, it's a subject matter expert, and you can analyze any kind of statistics or any kind of your residuals of discrepancy between your reconstruction and the original data. And again, this is more or less subject matter expertise because, I mean, for some people, one noise level is noise. For other people, something else is noise. I mean, noise is not uniformly